Okay, we might, in the interest of time and to give our speakers maximum opportunity to share their insights, we'll make a start. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bianca Bridgenath, and I lead the education program at NARI, or the National Aging Research Institute. You might notice that I am not Jessica Cecil, who normally does this exemplary job. But Jess is on some well-earned leave, so you're all stuck with me today doing a slightly less exemplary job. Anyway, we'll muddle along as best we can. So welcome to our online Seminars in Aging program. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us are meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. First, a little housekeeping about Zoom. At the conclusion of the talk, we will have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can submit them throughout the seminar using the chat function, which can be opened on the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Today, we're going to be hearing from Professor Colleen Doyle and Ms. Marcia Fern. Professor Colleen Doyle is a Senior Principal Research Fellow at NARI and a research consultant. She was Professor of Aged Care at the Australian Catholic University from 2012 to 2017. And a health service research partnership with Villa Maria Catholic Homes. In 2018 to 2020, she has provided contract research advice for the Federal Office of the E-Safety Commissioner, Nursing and Midwifery Health Program Victoria, and Interplast Australia. Her research with NARI focuses on two projects: BEFRIENDIS, the impact of befriending for older adults living in residential aged care, and PITCH, the development of dementia training for healthcare workers, both of which are funded by the NHMRC. Colleen founded the Australian Psychological Society Psychology and Aging Interest Group. She has published extensively on aged care, including as a lead author for a book published internationally in 2018 titled Moving into Residential Aged Care, a Practical Guide for Older People and Their Families. Our other speaker today is Marcia Fern. Both Marcia and Colleen are in the same office because they are having some technical difficulties. So while you can't see Marcia, she is definitely in the same space as Colleen, and you will see her a little later on when she hops on to present her work. Marcia has a background in psychology and social science and is a research officer as well as the research administration officer at NARI. She is the project coordinator for the BEFRIENDIS randomized controlled trial, which explores the impact of befriending provided by volunteers on levels of depression, anxiety, and loneliness in older people living in residential aged care. Previously, Marcia was involved in a randomized controlled trial that focused on treatments for anxiety and depression in people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, with a particular interest in the befriending component. Today, both of them, as you can tell from their expertise, will be presenting on what can volunteering do for you, resilience, befriending, and social support in the age of COVID. So welcome, Colleen and Marcia, over to you.
Thanks, Bianca. We'll just start sharing our screen now with any luck. And as Bianca said, we're going to talk today about volunteering. The acknowledgement of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has already been done by Bianca. Thank you. And so I'll step right into the aims of today's discussion. We'd like to introduce you to our BEFRIENDIS project and our volunteers and discuss how befriending has had an impact on our volunteers, and then outline some volunteer characteristics and perspectives, and take a chance to reflect on how volunteering is related to resilience, and finally discuss the scope for future research. So we've been conducting this BEFRIENDIS trial for a few years now, since 2018. And for those researchers in the audience, the trial is registered and you can look at the protocol details on the ANZ Clinical Trials Registry. But basically, we've been examining in a research framework, befriending. Befriending is conversation and social support provided on a regular or ongoing basis where we just discuss everyday topics and events in a friendly way without really trying to discuss health problems or problem solving about issues that the person has had, or trying to explore their emotions in the way that perhaps a health professional might do. We've been conducting a randomised controlled trial and also at the same time conducting some qualitative research with people living in residential aged care who have some symptoms of depression and up to mild cognitive impairment. So we've been asking people living in residential aged care if they would like to join this trial, and if they are interested and they give our ethics consent, then they're randomised into either a befriending group or a treatment as usual group. And if they're randomised into treatment as usual, they wait until we conduct some assessments of how their depression and their mental health is going over a 4-month period. And at the end of that period, they then start to receive some befriending visits. So everybody who comes into the trial does receive a visitor at some point or another. And we're very careful to make sure that no one is left behind if they express an interest in the project and in getting some more visitors. For the randomised controlled trial part of the research, we look at quantitative assessments of depression, anxiety, loneliness. We measure social support, and we do that at 3 time points: at the beginning of the trial, then halfway through, which is after about 2 months, and then at the end of the trial of befriending, which is after about 4 months. So each of those assessments is conducted by one of our researchers who are trained to do those interviews. At the same time, we've also been conducting some qualitative research with our volunteers, and they talk to us about the experience of befriending. We invite them to focus groups, or we do individual interviews with them, and we've been gathering all that qualitative information. They also do some recordings of the conversations that they are making with the residents' permission, of course. And so we have a huge database of qualitative recordings as well that we'll be analysing to understand more about the befriending, what's talked about, what the conversation is like, and so on. And we also are doing some qualitative interviews with the staff. We're talking to the families about their views of befriending. So we're taking a whole stakeholder view, really, of what's befriending like for people who live in residential aged care with some depression symptoms. So we're looking at the impact of befriending on the residents' mental health. That's the main randomised controlled trial result. We're also looking at the acceptability and satisfaction with the model. We have some health economists, Julie Ratcliffe from Flinders University and her team are looking at the cost effectiveness, because obviously with volunteers, the volunteers are giving their time for nothing. And we want to have a serious look at, well, what is the cost effectiveness of this kind of intervention for people living in residential care? And as I said, we're also interested in the impact on volunteers, which is what we're talking about with you today. But we want to make sure that we clarify that befriending is not a substitute for professional mental health treatment. So we're not aiming to find out or to substitute for psychologists or psychiatrists or medication as treatments for depression, but we're really looking at more evidence for what this kind of intervention can have, what sort of impact this can have. And perhaps it might be suitable in a model of mental health support as a supplement to those other things in the toolkits that residential aged care people can offer someone with depression. Obviously, the person with some depression symptoms living in residential aged care is the main focus for the Befrienders project. And what we're looking at is whether social support and friends and family and the care setting whether the mixture of all those things has any impact on the person's mental health, their depression, their anxiety, and also their loneliness. And we know that loneliness and depression are closely interlinked from previous research. And I like to talk about this adding volunteers in a third layer analogy, thinking back to when we all used cloth masks, and we were recommended to use 3 layers of cloth to protect ourselves against the COVID virus. I was thinking, now of course we use N95, so the world has moved on a bit, but I was thinking about the possibility of volunteers perhaps being an extra layer of protection for the person living with some depression in residential aged care. So the first layer of protection is obviously the staff and professional carers who can manage the person's depression in association with them. And then friends and family obviously have a big role to play in supporting the person living in residential aged care. And maybe volunteers can be that third layer of support to protect the person against these feelings of being low, feeling low, depression, anxiety, stress and worry and so on. So I'm just putting that seed of an analogy into your thoughts. People often ask us, well, what's so special about befriending? Is it any different to the community visitor scheme? Well, it isn't really. It's not that different. It's really just providing a research lens to an intervention of befriending, because we need better evidence that the community visitor scheme works well, and we need better evidence for how these sort of social supports can help to support the person in residential aged care, because we know that many people living in residential aged care are very lonely, and there have been not enough studies actually to show that a large proportion of people living in residential care have no visitors whatsoever. But so we need better research to understand, well, what's the impact of living in residential aged care without any visitors, and what's the impact of having a regular visitor? Our research, because we're a research project, it's slightly different to the community visitor model in that we give intensive training to our volunteers on what to expect. We talk to them about mental health and communication skills, and we do monitor them fairly closely to make sure that they're comfortable with the ongoing visiting. Because there are volunteers in a research project, there's no obligation for them to continue with this sort of activity. And we provide them with ongoing peer and supervisor support. And as I said, we're really doing a systematic examination of the intensity, frequency of befriending and the impact of our specific outcomes. And so we're hoping to have that better, more systematic result of what's the evidence for befriending by the end of this study. And we're doing a detailed examination of volunteering. So what does volunteering do for you? Is it good for the volunteer themselves as well as for the person that they're visiting? So I'll hand over to Marcia now to talk in a bit more detail about what the volunteers are doing and what are the results of volunteering. And then I'll come back after she's finished. So we're going to do a slick swap around in Marcia's office here.
Thank you, Colleen. Please bear with me whilst I quickly change presentations. We were supposed to be in separate offices, hence why we had different presentations, but I'm hoping it's all going to work. And I'm hoping you're now seeing my slide, which is titled Volunteers in Our Research.
We can see the slide, Marcia, just confirming that you've shared your sound.
Yes, it was clicked. So I'm hoping that it is going to work when it comes up to it, Bianca. So thank you. It was the option was still clicked when I shared my screen earlier. So fingers crossed.
No, you'll be fine. All good. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to give you a little bit of information about our volunteers that we have in our project. So we recruit our volunteers from a variety of different places. We use Seek Volunteer, we look at local volunteer resource centres, We use some of the individual aged care facilities and their volunteer pool. We've looked at the NARI volunteer pool, and we also go to universities and recruit university students. All of our volunteers are required to get a criminal history check, which we support them in doing so. And so far, we've actually trained approximately 200 volunteers. So about 200 volunteers have done either face-to-face training, which we started with initially. However, due to the COVID pandemic, that all changed to online, which we find is a much easier way for volunteers to do the training. And also all of our volunteers, as they're going into aged care, are required to have the necessary COVID-19 and influenza vaccinations. And as most of our training is done online, we do meet with the volunteers over Zoom as well, just to have a suitability check to ensure that they understand the requirements of the project, but also any questions they might have about the training that they've done. So to date, this shows a breakdown of who volunteers in Befrienders. Now, this is slightly different to what you would generally find with volunteers, in that most volunteers usually sort of within the 45 to 60 age group. However, the majority of our volunteers, or over a third of them, are from the 18 to 29 age group. And we think that most of this is because we get a lot of university students wanting to volunteer. However, it's fairly evenly spread across the other age groups. Common with volunteering in general is that we actually do have predominantly females who volunteer with us. So as you can see, 78% of the volunteers stated that they were female, 16% were male, and 6% didn't specify. So prior to our volunteers doing the training program with us, we actually asked them to complete a survey that looks at their knowledge, attitudes, and confidence in working with older people. So when we split their ages into two groups, so 18 to 49 versus over 50, we found no significant differences in their knowledge, attitude, or confidence. However, when we split them into those four age groups, 18 to 29, 30 to 49, 50 to 64 versus over 65, we actually found that there were some significant differences, mainly in the knowledge of older people, the knowledge subscale. So we found that there was a significant difference between our younger group and those over 65, where it was suggested that volunteers over 65 have a better knowledge of older people. Excuse me, my phone was just ringing. I haven't had my office phone ring for a long time. Sorry about that. Okay, so as you can see, so we assume that this is possibly due to their lived experience about aging. So what do our volunteers do? So as you know, our volunteers undergo training. Our volunteers, as Colleen said, are mentored and supervised, supported throughout the project. Many of them participate in focus groups or interviews, but the main thing that we ask them to do is to befriend in residential care. As part of the online training program, so this is a screenshot from our online training program, we cover background information about the project. We look at, we provide them with information about depression, anxiety, and mild cognitive impairment. Our residents who are involved in the Befrienders project are only able to have up to mild cognitive impairment. We tell them about befriending and what befriending is and how to do befriending, which also includes information around good listening and communication skills. We also touch base on safety considerations. So safety considerations for themselves and what they should and shouldn't provide, what information they can provide the resident about themselves. For example, do they feel comfortable providing their phone number to the resident and that sort of thing, and just to keep that in mind, but also safety considerations for the resident, particularly as the conversation and relationships develop, if there's information that the resident might share with the volunteer and what they should do with that information. And finally, we also touch base on the do's and don'ts of befriending and the volunteers' rights and responsibilities through the project. So our online training program is spread across 3 videos, and there's some questions after each video for the volunteers to answer. So I'd just like to show you a snippet of our training program, and this is the section that explains to the volunteer what they might expect when they first visit the resident in aged care and how they might initiate conversation. So I do hope that you can hear it. Please let me know in the next slide if you can't hear it.
At your first visit with the resident, the nominated resident's representative will introduce you both. Visiting a person for the first time may be slightly daunting as you don't know each other. This is normal and to be expected. Befriending is a simple process, but its implementation requires careful attention to ensure it is successful for both the resident and the befriender. You're not providing a professional health service such as counselling, psychological therapy, or health advice. So now you're here.
Oh. Sorry, it seems.
What do you do? Ask the resident what they wish to be called. Generally,
Sorry.
the resident will be happy for you to call them by their first name. However, it is always best to check. It is often easiest to begin with small talk, such as the weather. In the early stages of befriending, search for topics that the resident is motivated to talk about and enjoys talking about. Use things in their room, such as photographs or trinkets, to start conversations by asking the resident about them. The focus of befriending is on topics that are interesting to the resident, but do not focus on issues that raise negative emotions in the resident. Talk about neutral topics that the resident may be interested in. Childhood.
So that's just a very small snippet of part of our training program. So as you can see, so some of the things that we found through talking with our residents and so forth is, not our residents, talking with our volunteers about what helps them to do effective befriending. So some of the things are getting some information about the resident in advance. So our residents have said getting some of that initial information. I think having the little blurb that we're given at the start, like just before befriending them, that helped me a lot because I noticed on there that my resident had immigrated from England. So we do collect a little bit of information about the resident from in advance, and we provide that to the befriender, so that and also helps them provide that initial conversation. Another thing is matching up. So we do ask our residents whether they have a preference for an older or a younger volunteer, whether they would like male or female. We are limited sometimes with the amount of matching up we can do due to sometimes having a limited number of volunteers. COVID certainly impacted on our volunteer recruitment, which is starting to increase again, but it did impact a little bit. Being flexible, so our volunteers, if they're able to be more flexible, it helps to initiate the conversation, have effective befriending, and develop the relationship a bit more. So one of our volunteers said, I called him at about 2:10 because I know most places have happy hour around 2:30 on a Friday. So this volunteer obviously didn't want to interfere with happy hour. Some of our volunteers reported that being given support, so that includes support from both our project volunteer coordinator, who ensures that they're not having any issues, that they're able to initiate the conversation, that there's no concerns, but also support from a key liaison person at the aged care facility, whom we usually is usually the lifestyle coordinator or someone similar. And also being flexible in terms of being able to provide remote befriending. So we found particularly during the COVID lockdowns that we had here in Melbourne, being able to be flexible and revert from face-to-face befriending to doing befriending over the telephone or video call was really important. And even now, at present, many of the aged care facilities do go into COVID lockdown, or they might be in lockdown for influenza. And even prior to COVID, we found a lot of aged care facilities do experience various lockdowns over winter because of various illnesses and so forth, or even if the volunteer themselves is unwell. So we ask the volunteers to be flexible, and that does help by continuing and maintaining that support and the continuity of that conversation. But it also is important to keep in mind that the residents do have certain preferences for how they might like to do remote befriending. Ideally, a video call is a wonderful way of doing it. However, that's not always practical because some of the residents feel that that's a bit daunting. Many preferred the traditional technology such as phone. Some others really enjoyed receiving a letter in the mail, which is another way that some of our volunteers have kept in touch. So one of the biggest hurdles, and it was sort of shown through, that's why we put the tips in our training. One of the biggest hurdles is being able to start and initiate that conversation. We recommend, as we showed in the video, that you use visual cues in the room and start with light-hearted conversation. As you can see in the blue bubble, they started off talking about light-hearted conversation, about horses and cooking, and discovered that, they both had a connection with Elphington, which is where the volunteer actually lived, and the resident knew Elphington quite well. However, as things progressed, some of our, as time progressed and as relationships developed, some of our volunteers did develop more of a, how can I say, the conversation changed a bit. So, so we'll be talking about a philosophy passage for hours and decipher it just the whole time. And it's so being in the present moment, being in a room and you're in this strict environment where all distractions are gone, it's incredible. So this relationship really developed over their time of befriending. So there's no right or wrong topics to talk about in befriending, other than, as Colleen said earlier, trying not to focus on negative emotions or health problems and that sort of thing. So as long as both parties are happy and it's lighthearted conversation or conversation that they both want to be involved in. And you can see from both these quotes that it's the volunteer and the resident actually benefit from it. So some of the impacts of volunteering that we've heard from our volunteers, one said, I do live with a husband with dementia. So for me, the volunteering is a release. So she's able to go out and she finds it's something that she can do for herself. A positive thing, giving back to the community. It's good because it gives yourself and also the person you're visiting, it gives you both a sense of purpose that maybe your lives didn't have before. I think one of the benefits of this being part of this is the different generations that are involved. And another one said it's a joy to go in there and add value to people's lives. So I quickly would like to just find a video and share this video. This is from one of our befrienders who talks about how she's benefited from befriending as well as the experience.
Hi there, my name is Karen and I would like to share with you some of my experiences with the Befrienders program. I first matched with my resident back in March when lockdowns weren't back in place yet. I would say I was a little nervous before my first session, as it has been a while since I spoke to an elderly figure in person. One of the reasons why I chose to participate in this program was because I used to Skype my grandparents once a week who live overseas. However, I haven't been able to do so in the past few years. Therefore, I thought this was a perfect opportunity to do something similar but in a slightly different way. When I started chatting with my resident, everything just fell into place nicely. She was very eager to share her stories, and I loved listening to all her knowledge and past experiences. We have a lot in common, but also have many differences, and I think it has been really interesting sharing our different perspectives and beliefs. Things did become harder when lockdown came back into place, and we had to shift our weekly visits to phone calls. Some logistical things were hard to figure out at first, But now, even though I'm technically finished with my volunteering period, I still call her every Sunday for a quick catch-up. From this experience, I feel very fulfilled with the connection I've made with my resident. And it is also very rewarding when you know you're making their day just by giving a quick call and having a chat. Also, I think with the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us have not only felt physically but also emotionally isolated, and that includes myself. So I think from now on, if I look back in the future to this period of time, I will be reminded of the wonderful connection I've made with my resident instead. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll like to participate in this wonderful program as well.
So as you can see from listening to Karen and some of our other quotes, you know, we found that there's many benefits for our volunteers in the Befrienders project, as well as what we're finding for the residents. And this supports some of what the literature says about the benefits of volunteering. So it can combat loneliness, create social connections, broadens people's networks and professional skills, which I think is why we're finding so many university students participate in the Befrienders project. They're wanting to expand some of their skills. It can increase your physical activity, it improves their own mental health, and it allows people to become more outwardly focused. But I am going to finish there and hand back over to Colleen to sum up what we've discussed.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia. So just to wrap up then, we've been doing, as I said, we've been doing this project for a few years now, and we have another 12 months to complete our 5-year study. It's been a very large study. And as things are emerging, as the qualitative analysis is starting to come together, we were thinking about the concept of resilience as one of the ways that we can understand what volunteering can do for you. Resilience is the process and outcome of adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioural flexibility and adjusting to internal and external demands. That's a definition from the American Psychological Association. So resilience is really about bouncing back in the face of adversity and how you manage adversity. And I think we can all say that the pandemic has definitely been an adverse event for us all. And we know that resilience can be affected by lots of things for individuals. Obviously, everyone's different, and so the way people view the world can affect their resilience. The availability and quality of social resources can affect resilience, and obviously specific coping strategies that the person may have at their disposal. And we know that resilience can be improved by focusing on some of these areas. And it struck us in the Befrienders team that really volunteering has something to say about how people can support their own resilience and how they can improve their resilience through this second factor of availability and quality of social resources. So we've seen in autumn the terrible, devastating floods that happened around Australia, and before that, the bushfires that happened. And we saw in the media the wonderful examples of communities looking after themselves, looking after each other in the face of those terrible adverse events. And we know that volunteering can build those social bonds that happen and can build resilient communities by strengthening those social bonds. And we saw volunteers helping each other pull furniture out of flooded homes and helping each other to clean up after the bushfires and so on. And that strengthening of social bonds is something that really helped those communities to increase their resilience. But on an individual level, we can also consider, well, volunteering can build an individual's resilience. It can give them, as Marcia said, a sense of purpose. It can increase their self-esteem. It can relieve depression and loneliness in the volunteer themselves. And it can definitely improve social relationships, as we found the example of Karen and her grandparents not being able to contact them, but being able to contact a person in residential aged care through our project instead. So we know that there's been a lot of concern about mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Royal Commission last year and the year before mentioned the fact that mental health and social isolation has really suffered as a result of the pandemic for people with residential aged care. And there was an article in the BMJ Open a couple of years ago talking about psychological PPE, and some of our colleagues here at NARI have also written about this concept, about the fact that staff really need to enhance their own self-care and resilience by looking after themselves. And we think that assisting residents to protect their mental health with befriending can really assist their resilience in bouncing back from the restrictions associated with the pandemic, as far as isolation and so on. And we wonder whether volunteering might be a psychological PPE for the volunteers themselves to maintain their own self-care and resilience. And so this is something that we're starting to explore in our qualitative data sets. So in conclusion, I hope we've convinced you that volunteering has positive impacts on the health and well-being of volunteers. We've seen many cases of volunteers continuing to keep in contact with the resident that they had started befriending after their obligations in the befrienders trial had finished. And we've certainly seen in our qualitative findings to date that there's been some positive impacts on the health and well-being of the volunteers themselves. This is such a feel-good project. Everybody loves to be involved in it. We think that individual resilience is actually being supported through volunteering in this way, and it's something that we'd like to explore further in more research on the long-term impacts. Our intervention only lasts for 4 months, but we'd like to see studies looking at the longer-term impact of putting volunteering into your lifestyle as something that is maintaining and supporting your own resilience, and seeing whether that long-term impact of volunteering has any impact on your health and well-being. Whoops. So if you'd like to get involved, we're still looking for new volunteers and new residents to enrol, and we have expanded the Befrienders data collection to outside Victoria. So we now have researchers helping us in South Australia and in Western Australia. And we also have some data collection going on in New South Wales, and we're about to start in Queensland as well. So wherever you are in Australia, we'd love to hear from you if you're interested in getting involved in this project. As Marcia said, we're adjusting our contact. We're trying to pivot as much as we can to the local COVID-19 restrictions, and I suspect we're going to start to come across restrictions due to the flu season as well. So we're able to offer either face-to-face visits or remote visits, as Marcia said, by phone or Zoom or letter or text, or any way that we can keep in social contact with the resident. And so fully remote support is available for people living in remote areas, or we can try and find local volunteers wherever possible. So please feel free to contact me. There's my email address there, c.doyle@nari.edu.au, if you're interested in being involved in the project, or you'd like to hear more information about what we're finding. This is obviously a team effort. As Marcia said, we've had over 200 volunteers and over 200 people living in residential aged care join the project so far. And I've just listed there the project investigators. On the left-hand side are the original grant colleagues, collaborators. We couldn't do anything without our volunteer befrienders, so they're in the centre. And we've received funding from the National Health and Medical Research Council and Beyond Blue, and also Perpetual Impact to do a small sub-study about befriending with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We've so far had people from Chinese and Hungarian backgrounds, and we're about to have some people from Italian backgrounds as well in the study. And there's our wonderful fieldwork team. The coordinator is Marcia, and then we've got Victorian, New South Wales, WA and South Australian researchers helping us with the fieldwork. So we'll leave it there for now. Thank you for listening, and we'll hand back to you, Bianca.
Thank you, Colleen and Marcia. We've got questions coming in thick and fast. So I'm going to just start by reading the first one out and encourage others to pop their Q&A either in the chat, or feel free to put your screen on and you can ask the question directly from Colleen and Marcia. But in the meantime, our first question comes from Katrin Gerber, who says, great presentation, such a fantastic program. Have you ever encountered any challenges during the matching process, e.g. residents and volunteers not getting along or just not being right for one another? How do you deal with this?
Yes, thanks, Katrin, for your question. Yes, we have had that. Generally, it has mainly been that a resident might have said they had no preferences sometimes, and then they come back and say, actually, no, that person's too young. I think age has probably been the biggest factor that we found that has been why the resident would like a new befriender. Sometimes we have had instances where they've just not been able to connect, not been able to develop conversation. So in that instance, we do then just try and find them a new befriender and keep on going. So we don't, obviously can't force them to continue that connection and that befriending. We just then try and find one of our other befrienders who might be more suited.
And that ties in quite well with the research findings, the preliminary findings that Marcia presented on age differences in knowledge, confidence and attitudes. So sometimes the older person prefers to talk to someone closer in generation to them. But it's very individual. Some older people like talking to a younger person, and it's a breath of fresh air to have someone from a different generation. So we take each case on an individual basis, and we check up with the person, with both sides, how it's going.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Anita Gore, who says, thanks, Colleen and Marcia. Are you measuring intergenerational impacts of befriending, e.g. on attitudes, ageism between age groups in both directions, that is older people's attitudes to younger people and vice versa?
We're not measuring older people's attitudes to younger people, but we can certainly look at some analyses like that at the end of our study when we delve more deeply into the quantitative analyses and look at the extent to which the characteristics of the volunteer has had any impact on outcomes for the resident, particularly for the mental health outcomes. So stay tuned for the results of that. We won't have those. We won't be doing those detailed quantitative analyses until after Christmas. So we need to finish the data collection first. But good question. I think that going forward, we do need to understand more about the impact of the particular relationship that has been formed, the characteristics of both sides, and how that has had an impact on the outcomes that we're able to achieve.
Great. The next question comes from Meredith Butler, who says, so good to get research about befriending. Echo CVS knowledge in a more evidence-based framework. Thank you both. Now, what happens to participants after the project? Do they get referred to CVS for ongoing support?
Okay, yes, I'm happy to answer that. So great question again, thank you. Look, we do have some instances, so we've got multiple different ways that things can happen. So as you saw from Karen, she's actually still continuing to contact her residents. So in that instance, they do continue to, some of our befrienders do continue to maintain that contact. What we find is slightly different to in the research project. It's not as structured. We require our volunteers to keep track of when they visit, how long they visit, what sort of things they talk about, obviously, because we're collecting all that data. So they don't need to continue that. And potentially it might be that it might change to a fortnightly visit as opposed to a weekly visit. It all varies. However, if there are instances where the resident wants to continue having a visitor, but the volunteer isn't able to continue visiting, we do have instances where we've been referring to the community visitor scheme.
And the Community Visitor Scheme is a partner in this project, so they were supporters for our original grant application, and we've continued to keep in touch with them, certainly in the Victorian auspiced organisations. We kept in contact with them throughout the project, and we have a large number of residents who are referred to the project. And because unfortunately we're a research trial, we have eligibility criteria that means that many of those residents are not actually eligible to join the trial. So if they're interested in a visitor and they're not eligible to join the trial, then we do refer them to the Community Visitor Scheme. And they've been fantastic in accepting people when we refer to them.
Great. We've got a question from Ross Bell, who says, the training video about taking cues from the room is a great idea. Do you check about a consumer's hearing levels? It's quite an issue for some older consumers.
Thanks, Ross. We were really fortunate with our training video. Actually, I didn't provide the background for that. So we actually had a volunteer who helped us during COVID to develop that training program, and then a connection that she had actually volunteered as a voiceover for our training program. So we were very fortunate. So it's nice to hear good feedback about that. In terms of your query, in terms of their hearing and anything like that, so our researchers do collect information when they go and do the initial research assessment or interview. So things like, as I mentioned earlier, age and gender preferences for volunteers, but they will also make a note of things such as any hearing impairments, any vision impairments, anything else that might be necessary. And we then forward that information on to the befriender before they start.
Unfortunately, if someone is completely deaf, they're not able to join the trial. We do have people who are completely visually impaired, don't we?
We have had some who are legally blind.
Yeah. But if they can't hear, if they have some hearing impairment, then we can usually accommodate it. But if they're completely deaf, unfortunately, we're not able to.
All right, and I've got one question in listening to this. I've actually got about 5 written down here, but never mind. I'll just curtail myself to one. Now, bereavement and loss is not uncommon in aged care, and especially residential aged care. How have you come across that in your participants, and how have you supported your volunteers in the event that they have the resident they're supporting has died?
It has come up a couple of times, Bianca, where we have had, as you mentioned, it's not an uncommon situation. So we have had that come up. We offer support and any sort of counselling needed to our volunteers. To date, none of them have actually needed to take us up on that offer. So other than providing that as an option and support to them, I can't add any more to that.
I think it's important with these volunteer programs really to prepare them well before they start. And I think part of that preparation is really what to expect. Some of our volunteers have never been to an aged care facility before. And in fact, some of our researchers have been in the same situation as well. They've never been into a residential aged care facility. And so really covering that sort of what to expect and what might happen is a really important part of the preparation for starting this kind of volunteering exercise. It's not an easy volunteering gig in any way, shape or form. It's not like going to the community garden and starting to grow your own vegetables in the garden. This is a very sensitive social environment that the volunteer is walking into, and we need to be sensitive to both the residents' needs, and certainly with these residents in particular who have some depression symptoms, they're very vulnerable. They're a very vulnerable situation. They may have suffered grief in their own lives as well. Many of the people living in residential aged care have had to move in there, for example, because their carer has passed away, and so they're in that situation of grieving as well. So talking to the volunteers about those issues, about what it's like to go into a residential aged care facility, it can be quite confronting for a young person to go in and see a whole pile of older people. Sorry, I shouldn't have said pile, but a whole group of older people who are very frail and very vulnerable all together. It can be quite confronting, and it can make them think about, well, what are older people like if they haven't had much contact with older people. But talking to them about seeing individuals as individuals and seeing beyond the physical look of someone and getting to know them on a one-to-one basis can really help with learning about, well, this is actually okay, it's a normal part of life. And then having to understand that, yes, this person may be at the end of their lives, and in fact they may pass away. It's also something that we think is great preparation to think about and to reflect on, well, and to really acknowledge the fact that you may be providing a fantastic end of life experience for this person in the last few months of their life. You've been one who's actually been able to provide them with some social support. And what sort of brownie points can that give the individual? I think it can be just a fantastic thing to feel as though you've made a difference to an older person.
Thank you, Colleen and Marcia. Indeed, as you say, an absolutely feel-good project and profoundly meaningful. So that sort of brings us to the end of our seminar for today. Please join me in thanking Colleen and Marcia with your clap reactions. They're all coming in thick and fast, which is wonderful. And thank you, Colleen and Marcia. And please do join us next week at 12 p.m. when Professor Joan Osticevich and Elizabeth Watt from NARI will be talking about transforming continence in aged care. Thank you, everybody, for attending our seminars and aging program, and we will see you next time.